Welcome, Dr. Deanna Martinez. Thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you for having me. Very glad to be here.
Yeah. So your primary job here is psychiatry. You're a psychiatrist, but you've also chosen to take a path of some neuroscience research. Tell me a little bit about your work and your background and what you do.
Sure. So I'm a psychiatrist. I moved to New York City to go to medical school and then never left. Came to New York City actually to be a primary care physician back in Texas and ended up falling in love with psychiatry and neuroscience instead. And after residency, I did go into neuroscience research, specifically studying addiction because I felt as though there just wasn't enough treatments for addiction. Long story short, after doing that for quite some time, and being a little bit brokenhearted when it came to developing new treatments for addiction, which is another conversation, I decided to change my research and tried to look at repurposing existing treatments for new indications. And so I literally sat down with a piece of paper and said, okay, what kind of treatments already exist and what can they be used for? And of course, on that list would obviously be cannabis and cannabinoids for various indications. And I ended up with settling on neuropathic pain, specifically chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain. And that's the direction my research is taking now.
Beautiful. And so before we dive into where you're currently at in your research, I remember we had a conversation a while back about a lot of the emotional and mental health, depression, anxieties that your research is taking you. What are some of the things that you've worked on in that realm?
So most of my research has specifically been in addiction for many years now.
Okay.
And I certainly started out looking at the hardcore pharmacology of addiction, the neuroscience of it, the receptors involved, the neurotransmitters involved. And, over time, I definitely spent a lot of time teasing that apart, but also just recognizing that it is part of a picture and understanding the role that community plays, the role that connections play, sort of recognizing that, without having a network of resilience, I'll call it, we talk a lot about resilience and you can read a lot about resilience and the characteristics that make a specific person resilient. But in my mind, what it really takes is a network. It takes a network of friends and family and relationships that keep a person, going forward in life. And that's important whether your illness is an addiction, whether you're hit with cancer, whatever illness you get hit with, you really have to have that network to rely upon.
And I love the way that you say that, because several doctors in conversations that I've had recently have talked about that almost like an ecology that we have. We need to know that there's something, right? There's something out there for everybody, and we've got to figure out what are all these moving parts that are going to help us work through something. So I love that you talk about community. I think that's such a great part of it, especially dealing with something as lonely, I'm sure, as addictions, and also cancer can be very lonely as well. So I remember we had a conversation as well. You were talking about ketamine and how that is what purpose it's playing in some medical spaces right now. Can you expand on that a little?
Sure. So another study we have, as I said, I tried to repurpose existing medications. So ketamine is FDA approved. Honestly, ketamine research is a little easier than cannabis research because it doesn't have the scheduling issues and the DEA issues. So ketamine, we're looking at as a treatment for tinnitus or tinnitus, which is chronic ringing in the ears, is, maybe not a severe problem, but incredibly disconcerting if you have this, and remarkably prevalent. And we're also looking at ketamine for chronic pain, specifically in people who have end-stage renal disease and chronic pain. So that's sort of like, as I mentioned, I got tired of trying to develop new medications and I decided to repurpose old ones.
And so in all of your studies, it's been a couple of years now, but you kind of came upon your own path with breast cancer. Can you tell me how all of that started?
I absolutely can. So in May of 2017, which is my birthday month, I always have my mammograms around that time, and I went to do my annual mammogram, thought nothing of it. It was actually negative. And about 2 weeks later, I was in the shower and I found a lump in my armpit. And that's one of the things I try to make clear to people is we all talk about breast exams and whatnot, but a lump in the armpit in a woman is a medical emergency until proven otherwise. And lots of times we don't realize that. As soon as I found the lump in my armpit, I had a panic attack, went immediately to the doctor.
Gosh.
It was checked out, and it was indeed breast cancer, despite having a negative mammogram. It was actually found on an MRI scan. And I remember the phone call I got from the doctor who did the biopsy. He was an amazing man, did it quickly, did it in his office. I was desperate to get things moving. And he says, well, it's definitely cancer, but we don't know what kind yet because it's really poorly defined. And I remember so clearly. I was coming out this subway, I live in New York, and I thought, my life is over. Like, this is the defining of my life. My life is over because it's unknown what kind of tumor it is. I'm one of those strange people that when the MRI was actually done and it was discovered to be breast cancer, I was relieved because that was the best news it could have possibly been. I mean, honestly, any other cancer would have been widely spread if it had reached that point in my body. So, I discovered it was breast cancer, and just, you remember feeling like I'm going from walking down the street and feeling great. It's a sunny day, and knowing that I'm walking into a hospital facing chemo and surgery and radiation, and knowing like how brutal it's going to be when I feel well. It was hard to enter that tunnel when you feel great, but knowing that you had to in order to live my life, in order to see my kids grow up and graduate from high school and go to college. And it really changed everything. I did adriamycin cytoxin, which was pretty nasty.
Yeah, AC.
I honestly thought that was the worst of it. And I don't know why, but I convinced myself, it's that horrible red goo. How it can't get any worse, right? Paclitaxel was worse. It was absolutely worse. And I not only the joint pain and all this stuff, but after the first dose, I lost some hearing. I actually developed ringing in my ears, which was strange because I was already starting that research project, and didn't put it together with that being a neuropathic issue. And after the second dose, couldn't feel my hands, couldn't feel my feet, burning pain, stumbling, walking down the street.
So you're dealing with like terrible neuropathy during this chemo treatment. But really quick, I want to rewind to when you found out you had breast cancer. And why did you feel so relieved? Just because you knew?
I felt relieved because when, if you have cancer in a lymph node in your armpit, if it's breast cancer, it means it's just left the breast and trying to move elsewhere. If it's not breast cancer, it's everywhere. Right? So once it was clear that it was cancer in a lymph node, I'm like, please let it be breast. Please don't
let so
right?
Thankfully for the work that you do, you have that understanding. So that being said, there's immense amount of research and support therapies and therapies that are happening that can get rid of breast cancer. Like if you were to get diagnosed with breast cancer, today's the day. And that's a horrible thing to say, but there's a lot of treatment options.
Remarkably true. It's incredibly true. So I did my treatment at Sloan Kettering, which is actually where I did my internship.
Right.
So I walked in the door and I just had this PTSD at the hospital.
Oh God.
But, what struck me is that now Sloan Kettering has an entire separate hospital just dedicated to breast cancer, which is both good and bad news. It's good news because it is this incredible facility dedicated to the disease that I had, but it also just goes to show what an epidemic we have of breast cancer, that it's remarkable. Yeah. The time since I did internship until now, here I am a couple decades later, but still, it is just mushroomed into a full-on epidemic.
And and sadly for us, I mean, I've been involved with B4BC now for 15 years through a professional athlete career. And within that time, just seeing how many more and more young women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s that are managing breast cancer. And it's kind of scary to see that even in my 15 years of being a part of this organization, how that need is growing and growing and growing. It's a pretty, it's awful, like you said. And I think an epidemic is a good way to put it.
It's remarkable. As you said, I was relieved because we have so much data on how to best treat breast cancer. But at the same time, I went through the whole, I did the genetic testing. I sat down and discussed, I have no risk factors. I have no family history of breast cancer. I have no personal history of cancer. I have, no genetic background. And so, I can't say I have no history. Obviously I have no known risk factors. And that's the biggest question to me is we don't know what are the risk factors for so many of these cases.
And especially yes, sorry to interrupt you. I was just saying, especially as apparently around 80% of these diagnosed breast cancers, and in young women as well, there is no history, there is no gene tied to this. So it's this environmental factor, and interestingly enough, there's a lot of energetics, right? Like we've been talking to different doctors who are saying, yes, it could be the water, it could be their food, but it could be their stress levels. It could be, what they go through emotionally, their trauma health, so there's so many factors for us to try to figure ourselves out and see how we can work through this. So fast forward to you dealing with neuropathy and explain what neuropathy is a little bit, just in case somebody might not know.
Actually, at this point, I have read a lot about neuropathy, especially paclitaxel induced. And I have to say, every time I read the paper, I just had like this incredible feeling of creepiness, of just sort of recognizing what was happening in my own body.
Yeah.
The way paclitaxel works and the way that it inhibits tumor growth is it stabilizes microtubules. And essentially what that does is it prevents cells from dividing rapidly by making them rigid. The side effect, though, is that happens in the nerve terminals of the fingers and the hands, and they become very rigid, and so they start to break. And that's actually what causes the neuropathy caused by paclitaxel, is that those nerve endings, because they become sort of stiff and rigid, they tend to crumble and break, which is, I have to say, kind of unnerved me, so to speak.
Yeah, and there's pain involved, there's numbness involved. I know that I had a lot of numbness. My feet were killing me probably for at least 2 or 3 years after that. Like I could barely put shoes on. So it was really bad for you in both your hands and your feet.
It was terrible. And, and the more I read about it, especially with Taxol, it's very long lasting. Most people have it for years. Some people, it never recovers. So on top of, educating myself, you can imagine I was having an incredible panic attack. I was incredibly stressed out reading this. And, I had only done 2 doses. And I remember I was sitting in the kitchen. I had a piece of toast and I had a huge glass of water, because the only way I could get a piece of toast down was to drink a lot of water, because I actually had neuropathy affecting my esophagus. It was And at that point, I, when you add in the stress of cancer and the stress of steroids, because the high dose steroids and all this sort of stuff, I called my oncologist. I had a complete meltdown over the phone and told her that I would not do any more chemo, that I was done, and that I didn't care if I had a recurrence of breast cancer. I couldn't live without my nervous system. And I was surprised at her reaction. Her reaction was not, which I kind of expected. Her reaction was, because we're talking to doctor, I expected her to be like, stop being a baby and just do your chemo, right?
Oh.
Was, I understand this happens all the time. And I understand, there are risks. You have to weigh the benefits and the risks. And I was stunned to hear that this was an incredibly common problem. They had very little treatment options. She offered gabapentin. I took gabapentin. It did nothing.
What's gabapentin? Like a pain med or
pain med?
Pain.
Yeah, it's a pain med. People have studied it as a potential treatment, and it really didn't. The data isn't great, but I understand why not try it, right? It might work. Yeah. Also, I tried duloxetine, which is an antidepressant. I don't remember the brand name, but it's an SSRI like Prozac or Zoloft. It's duloxetine, and there is a study showing that duloxetine does help with neuropathic pain. But that study was done in all types of cancer and all types of chemotherapy. And the group that didn't improve was actually the Taxol group. And that didn't work for me either. And I was at my wit's end. I'm like, this is just going to be, I'm going to have this permanent problem. And I can't imagine, I was doing the 4-dose Taxol. I'm like, I can't imagine what's going to happen to me if I continue.
Yeah. Yeah. And those 4 doses, like I did mine in 12. So those 4 doses are huge, heavy hitters. And at this point, neuropathy, like you said, is years and years, and potentially you're facing the rest of your life, or 2, 5, 10 years, you don't know of this type of debilitating pain.
Right, right. And, I was still going to work, and I would like to get down the subway stairs. I had to hold the rail, which is, nobody wants to touch the rail, right? It's like,
Yeah. Don't touch the subway rail. Yeah. Worst case scenario there.
and so I just felt like I don't know if I can, if it's worth it. Like if I can't just go down the subway stairs and without grabbing the rail. So, as I said, I called my doctor. I was like, I quit. I'm not doing this anymore. As you can imagine, my friends and family were very upset because I was, only doing half of the Taxol that I needed to do. I was still going into work. I had my scarf, I had my puffy steroid face. And one of my colleagues at work, whose office is right next to mine, I've known her forever. Since I finished residency. She actually does cannabis research, mostly in addiction. People have an addiction to cannabis. That's what most of her research is. And she reminded me that there are studies in rodents showing that THC and CBD, so THC from cannabis plants and cannabidiol, improve neuropathy specifically caused by Taxol in rodents. And that it improves it, and that her reaction was, you have to try this before you quit chemo. And I sat down in my office and I was like, she's right. I should try it before I quit chemo.
Yeah.
Now I want to say August of 2017. So I was eligible actually for medical marijuana in New York State. However, at the time it's better, but at the time I had to find an appointment. I had to get certified by a doctor, and then it took at least 2 to 3 weeks to get the card in the mail, and then I could go get, medical marijuana. At this point, I'm like, I'm supposed to do another Taxol infusion in 2 weeks. I don't have time like this. I got online, called a friend in Colorado.
Colorado. Yeah. They'll come through for you.
I can't wait. And it just so happened that my friend in New York had a friend in Colorado who also does cannabis research, who also was diagnosed with breast cancer, who was just a few weeks ahead of me in treatment, who had terrible neuropathy from paclitaxel. And so she knew exactly where I was coming from. And she had taken CBD for it, and it had helped. So I got a rush shipment from CBD, thinking the whole time I'm out of my mind. I mean, I'm a pharmacologist and a scientist. I'm like, it might work in rodents, but I don't know what dose to take. I don't know how much to take. I don't know if what's in this CBD is real or if it's garbage, because at the time there was no regulation. For all I know, there still isn't very many,
so it's hard to find your way, for sure.
And I'm like, this could be just grass clippings in a capsule. It did so happen that my friend in Colorado, who's also a scientist, had taken the same product, and she checked CBD levels on her own blood. So we knew that it had CBD in it.
Okay, good to know.
Good to know. So I started taking it. I randomly started with about what we think was 100 to 100 milligrams a day, maybe a little bit more, because at the time, you didn't even know how much was in each capsule. And my symptoms improved. And it
instantly.
I would say maybe about 6-7 days, so I still had another week before my next Taxol infusion. So by the time I was facing the next Taxol, my symptoms were improving. They weren't resolved, but they were definitely improving. Enough for me to have enough confidence to take the third infusion, which I did. And then before I got to the fourth infusion, my symptoms were definitely improving. By the time I got to surgery, which was about, I want to say, a month later, I had actually forgotten about the neuropathy. And in fact, I stopped taking CBD for surgery because, I didn't know what it was doing. So I stopped it for
contraindications. Yeah, you don't know.
I don't know. You don't know. And I don't know what else is in the product. I could have bleeding, who knows, right? So I stopped taking CBD for the neuropathy, and then the symptoms started to come back. I had a freak out, started taking it again, and the symptoms went away. And after that, as you can imagine, I did not stop taking it for about a year. I still take it, but when I remember,
Yeah, wow.
And so I really, I have to say, like, I don't know. There's no way for me to know. As a scientist, there's no way for me to say with definitively that CBD cured my neuropathy. I can't say that.
Because you're the one, right? You're the one person, or your friend, your colleague is the other one person, but everybody is so different. Like how is this going to work?
Right. It's so different, and there's no way to know. Like, could I have been the unusual case where it would have just worsened and then got better? Like, we don't know. There's no way to know. But still, convinced enough to actually do a research study on the topic. And that sort of brings us where we are now is, I started with my friend, Meg Haney is her name. Her office is next door to me. She does cannabis research. We read the data, we read the studies, we came up with a research to do this, to look at this. And we started going to funding agencies, including a private foundation. We went into this meeting. I still had my scarf on. Took forever. I mean, I don't know. It took forever for me to grow hair back. It took an eternity. And, talked about this study, and we got funded for it. So.
And this is with Paylene Thorogood?
She put us in touch with a company called Tilray. The foundation is actually called the Thompson Family Foundation Initiative.
Okay, great.
In charge with Tilray, which is a company in Canada, is giving us the CBD, the study is actually CBD plus THC, and we can go into add THC, but the company providing it is actually Tilray from Canada, and they're giving us a medication for free. And this is so incredibly important because their medication is pharmaceutical grade. Like, they have tested it. There's no grass clippings in a capsule. This is like, they know exactly what's in each capsule. They know that there's no pathogens, there's no pesticides, there's no heavy metals.
So, yeah, when you say pharmaceutical grade, you just kind of listed all of these reasons why, but does that mean that your extractions are done in a lab? Or, how is all of this happening? Are they creating some of this stuff in the lab, or is all of this grown from a plant? This is a whole plant, a hemp plant with the THC. I'm just curious.
It's all plant extract, so it's all extracted from plants. So it definitely has known amounts of THC, known amounts of CBD. It has other cannabinoids as well. But we also know that it doesn't have anything like mold or heavy metals or pesticides.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
And so how do people know if they're getting the good thing nowadays? Would you say that, finding something that's organic, or maybe looking at, there's like that seal of approval. Is it the COA or something like that?
There's really different. So if you were to go to a state dispensary and you got medical marijuana from a state dispensary, the likelihood that it's sort of, clean product, I'll use for the sake of a better term, is very high. Like, most states have high requirements for testing. I'll add New Jersey as the exception, which strikes me as odd, but most states require.
Come on, Jersey.
Most states require third-party testing, so you have to send the product to an independent lab before you can dispense it. New Jersey doesn't require that, which I find very odd, but most states do. And so if you were to buy medical marijuana from a state-approved dispensary, the likelihood that it's good product and that it's labeled accurately is very high. The downside of that, of course, is that there's a few downsides. One is it's expensive. I mean, there's just no way around it. State-approved is expensive. Two, it generally has THC plus CBD. I don't know much, but I know in New York, it's hard to get CBD alone. I know that is changing from a state dispensary. I know that is changing, but at the time you really had to have THC plus CBD. In my particular case, I didn't really want to take THC because I find it extraordinarily sedating. And I just have a very hard time waking up from it. I'm a lightweight. I also can barely beer without being extraordinarily sedated. So I just know myself, right?
Yeah.
And then I do talk to a lot of patient groups of people who want to take CBD, but don't necessarily qualify because obviously the qualifications for different states are different. New York State has a particularly high bar. So you have to have the qualifying indications, which some people don't have, yet they still want to take CBD. And I have no objection to that. You know, I mean, I think the downside of CBD is relatively low.
Mhm.
The main issue being quality of the product that people buy. And, you know, there's
Yeah.
unfortunately a lot of craziness going on with CBD. You can buy it from a lot of places. There really is no regulation. People really don't have to tell you what's in product or what's not. And so but I get asked a lot. So my best advice for the most part is I generally advise people to buy from Colorado. I think other states also are probably okay, but you know, Colorado does require statewide testing, independent testing. But the main, I think, what's most important, independent of the state, is that the company provide a certificate of analysis. And we can go over, you know, what to look for in this, in the slides. I do have that. Most companies will not give you the certificate of analysis until after you've bought the product. So after you buy the product, there's a batch number on that. You can go onto their website, you can type in that batch number, and you can pull up the COA. Few companies will let you see that before you actually buy the product, which I honestly think you should be able to see it before you buy, you know, before you spend money on this. But that's sort of been the option. Oh no, did I lose you guys? Oh no, can you hear me?
Hello, looks like we lost somebody here.
Yeah, I think we lost.
Yeah, we lost. Okay. She's in Costa Rica. Her feed might have dropped. So let's just hold. I'll keep recording. Let me hold for 1 second. I'll get right back to you.
Sure.
I'll stop the video. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, you're back now. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. No, actually, we're okay. We'll go. You guys pick right back up. Let me unmute. Sorry.
Okay. Hi. Okay, so really quick, just to kind of wrap up the COA, you really want to look at a COA that's somewhat updated, right? You don't want something that's 5 years old, or that would be a good, yeah.
It needs to be
okay.
Recent. It should be done by an independent laboratory. It should tell you exactly how much CBD is in the product and other cannabinoids, and it should tell you about whether pathogens, mold, bacteria like salmonella, pesticides, and heavy metals.
Okay, good info. Really quickly, I did want to ask you, I'm kind of curious. So on this study that you're doing between Taxol or paclitaxel and cannabis THC, are you using humans or rodents?
Oh no, we're doing this study in people. I don't really do rodent research because just don't.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. You mentioned the rodent research, so I mean, you never know. But
right, that's my job. Is I look at rodent research and I try and apply it to humans. So
okay, great.
Women who have breast cancer, who had a previous diagnosis of breast cancer, who received paclitaxel or docetaxel, either one, and who have neuropathy, painful neuropathy. And the study, we're using cannabinoids, and we're looking to see whether or not a combination of THC and CBD is helpful for pain. That's our primary outcome measure. And then we're also looking at numbness and function.
Wow, interesting. And I love that you're using a bunch of women, just because I know that, you know, there are some studies out there on cannabis, and it's often done with men. So I think it's a great thing that you're using women, you know, mainly or all women on this. I think it's exciting, and I think it's such great work.
It is exciting. It's different from anything I've done before. I do find it, you know, incredibly rewarding. I mean, I did find my previous research with addiction also very rewarding, but you know, I work with a number of oncologists who are very excited that we're doing this work, and you know, because it, you know, oncologists, when we go see your oncologist, their primary concern is saving your life, right? And so all the other things are kind of like, you know, all the other things like, you know, the hair loss, which you know, not great, you know, they don't really worry about that much. But neuropathy, they worry about because they know that it can be really debilitating and it might not go away. So they've been very excited that we do this research, in addition to the people who've enrolled in our study, who've all been fantastic And, I apologize to everyone who enrolls in our study because normally the research that I do, so I'm a little lost, most of the time I do pharmacology. I don't normally do, questionnaires about pain and send people out the door with a bag of marijuana, but that's what I'm doing now. And so,
sounds like a good job.
Capsules, but to get the approval took a long time. It took a lot of perseverance to get approval to do this. Actually, the FDA was incredibly friendly and helpful. We thought that the DEA was going to kill us. The DEA does have a lot of regulations. We have, it's mostly CBD with low levels of THC. We have this huge safe room that you can only get into when you scan your finger and your ID, and then you have a code, and then you have to get in there, and then you have to.
Wow.
So it's, it's something out of like a spy movie, right? But
yeah, and I think the really powerful part of this is, yes, you're a researcher, and yes, it's your work, and you're passionate about it, but you've been in the place where a lot of these women are currently at, that you're working with, and you're able to provide that. It could be okay. Hopefully it's okay, but it could be okay for you because here I am.
Right. And, and I just want to add, like, the other lesson that I really learned from all of this is, as a researcher, I really just relied upon myself. I wrote the grants, I wrote the papers, I had research assistants that usually kids right out of college who are amazing and do a lot of work, but I was really fairly independent. When this hit me, when cancer hit me, I couldn't do anything by myself. And my colleagues all filled in. I mentioned the one who I'm doing the research study with, but also other people at work. I would show up to work. I looked horrible. I would edit a paper. I would make a mess. I would work on spreadsheets. I'd make a mess. And my colleagues really came to my help. And even outside of work, my friends, parents of kids that I knew, people really came out of the woodwork to be helpful. And it was remarkable because I was reluctant to ask for help. I always felt like I should be able to handle this by myself, and I'm a strong, independent woman. And honestly, when I asked for help from my colleagues and my friends and my family, people were over the top willing to be helpful. And it really took just such a huge burden off my shoulders and let me have the time to heal. So that was important.
Aww.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. And really, again, you got to experience everything you spoke about earlier, which is a big part of your research, the community, the network, how everybody is supported. Oh, I think that's beautiful. So all the research aside, where are you at currently in your own breast cancer treatment or journey? Or
so I actually did, I did AC, Taxol, surgery, radiation. I have to say radiation was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. And then I actually had triple negative breast cancer. And, once you're done with all of this, you just sit and wait. There's no sort of ongoing drugs like you might have if you have Herceptin positive or ERPR positive. And that was very nerve-wracking to me. And, to just sort of sit and wait. And then a research study came out from actually Korea and Japan showing that women who took an additional 6 to 9 months of a chemo called capecitabine increased their likelihood of not having recurrence, so decreased the recurrence rate. And it was a pretty significant finding. So I actually took an additional 7 months of oral chemo. It's called capecitabine. I forgot.
Oh, wow.
I forgot the brand name. And that was pretty nasty. It was pretty yucky. You take it for 2 weeks and you get a week off, and it was pretty nasty. And I have to say, I'm glad I did it, and I'm glad I sort of followed the research. But it was tough, and I really had faith in my oncologists. I had faith in the data, but I also learned along the way. You have to balance these things. I mean, I am a hardcore neuroscientist as much as it goes, but I really had to learn to balance the additional chemo and the hard treatments with, taking care of myself and exploring things like acupuncture, which I can tell you I previously had no faith in, yoga, which I have zero balance, none. I never have now, but I recognize this. Part of learning to adjust to this was learning to have some balance, learning to new skills and wanting to,
Accept help and then learn to help yourself and then accept some more help from somebody, because like you said, you were that strong woman. You're going to go. I can't tell you how many stories, including my own, that I've heard and I've listened to, that it's, you know, we're the strong women. We're going to do it all. And it's okay because we're mamas, we're business people, we're running companies, we're running households, and we can do it all. We're multitaskers and we love it. And then, no, don't worry, I can do it. Right. But then there is a time where we kind of need to receive and learn how to receive. And part of learning to receive is also giving to ourselves without being like, oh God, I should be doing something else. You know, so it's.
Absolutely. And I was amazed, like even my sons who are teenagers now, but at the time were smaller. Like, I mean, I would come in from radiation, I would go to work, I'd go to radiation, I'd get in the front door, I couldn't move. And my kids who were little, you know, at the time, 9 and 15, would bring me tea in bed, you know, and you hate to expect things from your kids, but honestly, it helps them grow up to be better men for it.
Yeah, it does, right? And I always worried about my kids. Were really small. My son was 1, my daughter was 6 at the time, and I was like, oh God, I'm scarring them for life. And I'm like, you know what? They chose me. They chose me as their mama, and we're gonna get through this. And you know, we did. So, yeah. Is there anything that?
Yeah,
What's that? Sorry.
I think my kids handled it all better, like, you know, with me losing the whole scene, by having a role in being helpful, as opposed to me telling them, no, you know, my job is to take care of you. Your job is not to take care of me. And that applied to my family, my sister, my mom, you know, my friends too.
My husband had a role, and that was that hair part. I know you and I have had conversations about how devastating it is to lose your hair. We decided to do cold caps. And it was something that no one had really done in the cancer agency I was at in Vancouver. But it was my husband's job, right? Like I had the 16 chemo treatments, and he was going to be there for every single one. He's going to put these crazy caps on my head. I look like some weird futuristic genie, Velcro straps around it, and he'd change them out every 30 minutes. And, you know, halfway through chemo, I was also like, I can't do this anymore. I'm sick. I'm vomiting. I said, I give up. And he said, no. He said, we made a deal, and we're not going to know if these work unless we give it 100%. Now sit up and let me put your cap back on. And I was just like, oh, but it gave him the job. I still lost my eyelashes, my eyebrows, all the hair on my body, and, you know, my hair thinned quite a bit, but I still had this scraggly, greasy little braid back there. And that was, you know, something that kind of helped me be able to see my reflection or look in the mirror and just be like, okay, I'm going to get past this a little, and wear just big glasses. I need glasses now. So I wear the big glasses that could hide things, but it's a devastating thing. And I hope that there's more science and more research around these cold caps, and they're more widely offered, because losing your hair isn't a vanity thing. You know, losing your hair can be everything to some women.
It's tough. You know, I ended up not doing the cold cap because I was so rushed to start that I didn't, like, if I did that, I was going to be delayed. And the tumor I had was particularly aggressive. And so they were just like, get in the door. But yeah, I underestimated how hard losing my hair, and frankly, how long it would take to grow back. But, you know, people were supportive, you know, people didn't, you know, my friends, my family got used to the one scarf I think I wore practically every day, you know, so.
Yeah, well, that's beautiful. I remember, didn't you tell me kind of the story once about you got some sort of a product from somebody, and that you were like, I'm going to test drive this on one side of my face? What?
One of a good friend of mine is a dermatologist, and she and my sister is also actually a nurse practitioner, gave me Latisse, which it's a medication that was developed for glaucoma, but it was discovered to grow fluffy eyelashes. So people use it to grow eyelashes. You use a little brush. And I decided to try it to see if I could grow eyebrows. I didn't care that much about eyelashes, but I had no eyebrows. So being a scientist, I put a little drop and I brushed it on one eyebrow, but not the other, to see if it would have an effect. And sure enough, I ended up with one eyebrow.
I mean, and you're not going to get rid of it because it's there, right? So that's awesome.
For eyelashes, it's not for eyebrows, but I was like, I'm going to try it. I'm going to be scientific about it. And then I had one eyebrow. And then I started doing it on the other side. It took forever.
Thank you. That was incredible. And I so appreciate all of the research you're doing. And I think it's a pretty magnificent thing that you have the perspective that you do and you're continuing the work that you do. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. I'm happy to talk about it. I love talking about this. If you or any of your viewers need to get a hold of me, you can, if you search Martinez, Colombia, you'll find my lab website and my email and phone number all there in case anything comes up.
Great. That's perfect. Well, we will definitely share you as well. And I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Martinez.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Well, there was Dr. Martinez, and I can tell from the chat that people are really interested here. And I appreciate the personal side of this, but it's also important to keep, it helps us keep the perspective when we understand that there are people interested in making sure these studies get done for us. So I want to welcome Dr. Deanna Martinez here with us, who's going to join us on this Q&A. I've seen lots of interesting things popping up here. Hi, Dr. Martinez.
Hello, good to see you again. It's great to be
you too.
Preventative health.
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, lots of questions here, and we realize that maybe some of them will be, more appropriated toward Paylene, and we're happy to make sure that Paylene gets some of these too. But Suzanne has a question for you around HR positive cancer. Suzanne, do you want to ask in person? No? Okay. I will ask for you. So her concern is THC and estrogen. Are you aware of any interactions there? Because she's heard and read a lot of conflicting opinions.
So there absolutely is a possibility for drug-drug interactions when it comes to THC and CBD. They can inhibit the metabolism of some drugs, so you do need to be careful. Actually, in our study, we don't give our product when people are receiving active chemo because we don't know if it can change, if CBD and THC can change chemo levels. We do accept people who are hormone receptor positive after they finish the acute phase of chemo. So if they're still taking aromatase inhibitors or tamoxifen or other drugs like that, they are allowed in our study. The potential for a drug-drug interaction goes up the higher the dose. And so, for example, if you're talking about low-ish doses of THC, 5 to 10 milligrams, low-ish doses of CBD being 100, 200, 300 milligrams, I think the likelihood of a drug interaction problem is fairly low. The exception being drugs like anticoagulants, like Plavix and warfarin, those are always a problem. But specifically drugs that are used for hormone receptor positive chemo are generally okay as long as you're taking lowish doses of cannabinoids. But I would still, if there's a concern, I would still talk to your doctor and you can check levels. So.
Interesting. Good information. Thank you.
I think our next question comes from Sarah. Sarah, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Looks like you have a couple here. Maybe not. Okay, I will ask it for her unless she can pop on. Oh, are you there? No. Okay. So the first question she has is, what are some good resources to check to make sure this is safe for me specifically?
So there's really, there's in my mind, there's 3 sources of cannabinoids. There's the stuff that you get from friends or neighbors or your teenage son. We'll call that the sort of unregulated, completely unregulated stuff. Right? There's product from medical marijuana dispensaries, and then there's product online, and that's mostly CBD. So the unregulated stuff, nobody knows what's in it, and it can be problematic. It's okay for most people, but if you're immunocompromised from chemo treatment, I think it's problematic. And I would also in general tend to avoid inhaling product that's unregulated if you have a medical condition. So that's the issue. My main issue with the unregulated stuff is, more than anything, is it can have pathogens in it, as I mentioned, mold, some bacteria, and some other pesticides and whatnot. So if you're using unregulated product, I would just sort of steer away from necessarily inhaling it. If you're talking about medical marijuana from a state dispensary, practically every state has fairly rigorous testing. And so you can be fairly certain that you're taking, that the dose that you're taking, that'll be labeled appropriately, and that it's free from pathogens. So that's the advantage of medical marijuana. Well, first of all, you have to live in a state that allows it, but the advantage is that the product is known. The disadvantage is that it's fairly expensive. And then the third source of product is online CBD. And that's a big one, online or whatever, store-bought CBD. And my main issue there is really just knowing the safety of the product. And as I was mentioning in our conversation, in my mind, the most important thing is looking at the certificate of analysis. So somebody who's selling you CBD, whether it's the store or online, should be providing you with a certificate of analysis, which I'll try to post one at some point, but you can look it up. It tells you exactly how much CBD and THC is in the product. It should have less than 0.3%. It should tell you whether it's been tested for pesticides or various solvents or heavy metal, and whether it's been tested for things like mold and bacteria. And I would not buy from a vendor that won't provide that. Many times when you buy CBD online, they won't give it to you ahead of time. Once you buy the product, you get a lot number, and then you can go on the website and you can check the COA then. I'm not a big fan of that. I'd rather see it ahead of time, but still that's better than no COA at all.
Okay, that makes sense. A follow-up question from her is, does this study follow all types of neuropathy? I have gastroparesis that they think is a neuropathy from chemo. Just wondering if my type would benefit.
So in this specific study, we're actually looking particularly at painful neuropathy. We are really very much wanting to do a study looking at the neuropathic symptoms at large, not necessarily pain, but the numbness, which would include gastroparesis, sort of a loss of function. We're really looking more at pain specifically in this study. So at this point, we are not including simply gastroparesis. I do hope future studies will, and I do hope that, I understand, believe me, gastroparesis is terrible. And, as I mentioned in my conversation, like I did try CBD and my gastroparesis did improve. But again, I don't know if that's scientific or if that just happened to be me.
Great. Thank you. Next question comes from Janet, and Janet has done 2 rounds of chemo, different rounds, and she's had really bad neuropathy. And why don't you ask your question, Janet, if you're there?
Hi. My question is how there's like the Dirty Dozen list for veggies and fruits and produce. Is there a list that we could reference for any of these products?
Yeah, there are some attempts to try and get better lists of products. And there's one called the U.S. Hemp Authority has a list. There's another one, the name of which is escaping me right now. Some of these organizations are requiring more testing in order to be on the lists. But again, in my mind, I specifically require that a company have a COA available. And as I mentioned, they usually won't give it to you right ahead. If you call them, they will give it to you. And the ones that I have contacted most recently, there's one called RE Botanicals. There's another one called CW Hemp. There's another one called Elixinol that have usually a COA done. But I will say that, it changes. And so that's part of the problem, because there isn't a requirement and because consumers aren't demanding this information, it changes because it's expensive. So that's my best advice.
So would you say the COA is like, if we were to shop for food at the grocery store, there's things that say like certified humane or, gluten-free. Is that like the label that we should see something that says COA? That would be.
Right. you have to dig on their websites to find it. What I've done sometimes is I just call up the company and say, I would like for you to email me your most recent COA from your most recent batch, and usually they will. I look forward to the day when you can just log on and you can see it right there. And it's also important for the COA, a certificate of analysis, to be done by an independent lab rather than the same company, right? So you want it to be done. The COA should say the lab that ran the analysis and exactly what tests they did.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
You know, one question that Janet had, I saw come up in the chat, and I know there's a lot of other women after Paylene's talk as well. How can people maybe get involved in your neuropathy study? Or is there a place where they can go and maybe fill out an application on a website to see if they're qualified to be a part if they're interested?
You're gladly and happily recruiting for this study. We had a big problem with COVID, which was, you know, we had just gotten momentum going, so we're starting it up again. We do require that you live in New York City or nearby New Jersey, because we have to Uber people in. Because it is Schedule 1, we have to hand it over to people specifically. So that is one thing. You can look me up if you just put in Diana Martinez, Columbia University, it'll pull up my website, and you can contact us there to participate in the study. If you live too far away, as I mentioned, you know, it's worth trying either medical marijuana in your home state. Our dose, we're using about 5 milligrams of THC, 100 of CBD. We have some people who can tolerate. Most people in our study are not people who use cannabis regularly, so 5 milligrams THC is we, you know, can have some effects. But, you know, I would start low and then work your way up. So I would recommend either, if you don't live near us, if you live near me, please come into our study. If you don't, try your home medical marijuana dispensary. And if needed, you could try online CBD. And yes, in our, I'm seeing some of the questions here. In our study, we do use oral capsules because we do want to have a known quantity, and we get those capsules from Tilray. Okay.
Well, we are going to wrap this up right now. That was so much great information, and just letting everybody know if they have additional questions to hit us up. Also, you can find Dr. Martinez, as she mentioned. Can you please tell us again? We'll put it up in the chat here. Oh yeah, it's in the chat. Frankie put it. Frankie, you're on it. You're in the chat here, and that's how people can find you. But your information is so valuable, and your own personal story. Thank you so much for sharing. It's so important for everybody